Once they reach that threshold towards high income, it becomes much harder to grow faster. Your economy has to be much more efficient, much more complicated, much more complex. The link between education and economic growth is very strong.
How many years may it take for Kazakhstan's economy to become a high-income one?
Kazakhstan is moving towards high income.
Is it possible for economists to stay optimistic in the current period of time?
It's definitely possible.
Hi everyone and welcome back to the Astana Times YouTube channel. I'm your host Astana and I'm delighted to be joined tonight by Ivailo Izvorski, World Bank Chief Economist for Europe and Central Asia. So thank you very much, Ivailo, for carving your time out for us to talk about the very important topics. And I would like to start tonight with some basics. Could you explain what the middle income trap is in simple terms and why has it been so hard for countries to escape it?
So the middle income trap is a situation, it's a phenomenon where countries experience growth slowdowns, and these growth slowdowns are repeated. So that even though they may have been growing strongly when they were a little poorer, when they had little lower incomes, once they reach a certain level of income, once they reach that threshold towards high income, it becomes much harder to grow faster. And the reason for that slowdown in growth and middle income trap is simply this slowdown, and the difficulty crossing the threshold, is that it becomes more complicated to change economic structures, to change policies. The more advanced you become, the more complicated these economic structures are. And so the policies that took you from low income to middle income, invest more, make sure all kids go to school. These policies are not the one to make you to high income. More efficient, your economy has to be much more efficient, much more complicated, much more complex. And that's the difficulty, that it's more difficult to achieve this once you reach the high income threshold. That, by the way, is about $14,000 at present per capita per year, per capita. And it's defined by the World Bank. It was a lending threshold, started in 1987. Every year it's adjusted by the pace of inflation of what we call the SDR deflator. So increases every year, but this year was $14,005.
So you're covering the region of Europe and Central Asia. Were there any examples of countries that succeeded in escaping this situation?
Thank you. There are quite a few. The countries of Central Europe that joined the European Union in 2004, 2007, 10 countries have all become high-income economies. And, countries such as Estonia, Czech Republic, Poland, and many others, of course, they have successfully become high-income economies and even beyond. So one interesting example is that in 1993, Estonia and Poland had incomes per capita that were about 1/4, 25% of Japan's income when adjusting for prices. We call it purchasing power parity. By 2023, their incomes per capita, again adjusted for prices, purchasing power parity, was the same in Japan. A dramatic improvement in living standards over a period of 35 years.
And what was the turning point, if you could explain just briefly in the examples of the countries that you mentioned? Is there any turning point that, helps countries transition from middle income to high income?
So once they start this transition, once they emerge from low income, which for these countries was many decades ago, the types of policies these countries introduced after 1990, when the transition from planned to market economy began, right, there was a certain determination among the political parties, the political elites, the social elites, of what progress would constitute. No? And so they went very decisively to change their market institutions, went very decisively on the path of market economy, protecting property rights, disciplining state-owned enterprises, privatizing a lot of them, and making sure that these incumbents, enterprises that have leading positions in the country, do not interfere when smaller companies, young companies want to enter the market. So they also integrated well with the world economy. In that case, the European Union, but also the broader world. They brought a lot of investment, a lot of foreign knowledge, foreign expertise. That was tremendous. And then, last but not least, they trade a lot with the world. When you trade, you also bring knowledge, you also bring experience. You become much more efficient domestically. And so they achieved all of that. Improved their education as well. And in general, they became much more efficient, streamlined, integrated economies.
Now, I want to focus more on your objective of your visit here in Kazakhstan. I know that you are presenting here a companion report. Could you share with us what are some key takeaways that one could take from the report?
The World Bank prepares what we call a World Development Report. And that report was called the Middle Income Trap. Now we said, look, that report was on the middle income countries around the world. But for Europe and Central Asia, for ECA, there are 20 middle income countries that are still not, obviously, high income. What would it take for them to become high income economies? And so we wrote a report, we call it Greater Heights, in which we said, okay, what would be needed for these countries to become high-income economies? And we followed the framework of the WDR, World Development Report, and then we looked at these countries. And we conclude that countries that have been successful in reaching high income, actually, they undergo two transitions. And one is the transition from investment, right? Focusing on investment in physical capital, machinery, equipment, human capital, moving from there to what we call infusion, right? Not injekcija, not infusia. This is import and the spread out, the diffusion of knowledge, technologies, right? Import and the spread. Often this is called technology adoption, but it's foreign technology adoption, meaning you integrate with the world and you bring this. So the first transition is this, just investing and then investing, but with the purpose of bringing foreign technology. And the second transition is once you master, and it's not the country that masters this, these are individual enterprises that master this. Once they master this process of investing and bringing foreign knowledge and spreading it domestically, these enterprises, they start to innovate. So the next transition is supplementing this investment and the infusion, the technology adoption with innovation. So if you cross these two transitions, right, you're more likely to reach high income status. Now, what is the process that results in this? We call it creative destruction. Actually, the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter calls it a creative destruction, where there are forces that create new things, new enterprises, new habits, new arrangements. You destroy outdated arrangements. Through this process of creative destruction, new enterprises come in, they replace some of the old ones, they change some of the existing ways of doing business, new ways of teaching and improving the quality of education come in. And, energy, for example, which is such a crucial component of economic growth, new ways of using energy much more efficiently so that you reduce costs and make it more affordable. So these are broadly the two things that we discuss in our report.
I see. So if we focus on Kazakhstan, where do you see Kazakhstan on this, if we could imagine it as a vector, I mean, transition and the steps that you just mentioned, where would you position Kazakhstan?
So Kazakhstan is probably in the stage where Kazakhstan is transitioning from investing and bringing foreign knowledge, right, investing in fusion, towards the phase of innovation, right? Yeah. It's getting to a stage where its companies are starting to innovate. And to cross the threshold to high income, more and more enterprises have to be much more innovative, no? They have to be not only just bring foreign knowledge, adopt foreign knowledge, but have to start generating innovations. And innovations are not inventions, right? I mean, they could be, but innovation is a new way of doing something, new way of producing a product or some variation of a product, or something that is not available domestically but could be available abroad. And so Kazakhstan is at that stage. And to make the transition to high income, its enterprises have to become much more productive and efficient and much more innovative.
Just one question that comes to my mind. If we could assume how many years may it take for Kazakhstan's economy to become a high-income one?
So, the way we look at this, if we take this World Bank threshold of about $14,000 and we say Kazakhstan GDP per capita is now, $10,000, $12,000, you could say if the country grows by, let's say 6-7% a year, it could take maybe 5-6 years. The government aims to double income per capita by the year 2029. This would require a very dramatic increase in the growth rate. And certainly if the government succeeds in doubling income per capita by 2029, the country would definitely become high income by then. So it's not going to be very far as long as the country accelerates, picks up the pace of economic growth now from, we project, about maybe 3.5% or so over the medium term. And if this remains the pace of economic growth, you subtract population growth, that's probably a little bit on the low side. So accelerating the pace of economic growth would bring crossing that threshold much faster.
So indeed, the government's ambitions are quite ambitious. The government aims to double its GDP by 2029 and to reach a 6% growth. But what we see from the figures, from the government figures, is just that economic growth was 4.8% in last year. That's what figures say. But now I want to focus more on the specific topics that you mentioned, and I want to start from education. What is the link? What is the obvious link between education and economic growth? And I want to talk more about social mobility, which is a key element as well.
So the link between education and economic growth is very strong. Often we don't see it in the data very quickly because, even if you improve this year the education of people that are in first grade, second grade, third grade, it's going to be some years before they go into the labor market and they impact the labor market. So even if you measure an improvement in education, let's say you test students this year, the usual PISA test for ninth graders, 14-year-olds, you test them this year and it shows a dramatic improvement. Well, these people are not going to go into the job market until 3-4 years later. And so therefore the impact on economic growth may be felt only with a delay, right? But nonetheless, if you take into account this delay, the link is very strong, right? Better education builds human capital, better skills, expertise, leads to more innovative activities. Smarter people innovate more. And also smarter people are able to diffuse. The infusion process can absorb knowledge from abroad more easily. So all of that clearly impacts economic growth. So the link is super strong. It just often when we measure education quality and we see an improvement, the improvement in growth may not be immediate because of the lag in joining the labor force. And often, besides the knowledge in school, there is knowledge on the job, right? There's on-the-job training. Yeah. People learn by being on the job. So it's not immediate, but ultimately it shows up and it's very strong.
So you mentioned smart people contributing to economic growth, but I think that only happens in countries where there are opportunities, right, for people to move up in the career ladder or to move up in their jobs and educational levels. But that's not always the case, right, in the region that we are discussing.
Well, that's not always the case, and not just in the region, everywhere. I mean, you can get excellent education if you don't have opportunities, if you cannot find a job. What use is it, no? Indeed. And so you may stay home and do nothing, or you may leave, work abroad. And so therefore the lack of these opportunities is, as you said, it's absolutely essential for the improvement in education to translate into improvements in economic growth, indeed.
So how would you assess, are there the opportunities for education here in Kazakhstan? I mean, in terms of social mobility as well that we mentioned?
So, social mobility is this perception, the realization that you are doing better than your parents according to some criteria. In our report, we look at education. Are kids born, for example, let's say 1990, so the last decade of the 20th century, which is the last year for which we have data, are they doing better than their parents in terms of getting more education? So this is one. Are they getting more education than their parents? The other way one can think of this is, if, let's say, my father had a university education and I have a university education, but if my neighbor's father did not have university education and he did not have university education, this is a very strong correlation between the education of parents, education of children. This is not good. You would want, for mobility, you would want there to be less relationship between education of parents and children. You want children to have equal opportunities to get a good education compared to their parents, right? And so on both of these metrics, whether the education of children is better than that of the parents, and whether there's a correlation, relationship between the education of parents and children. Most countries in Europe and Central Asia, unfortunately, there's a declining social mobility measured by education. And the same story goes for Kazakhstan. I think, many factors. Part of them, I think, are that the quality of education has been declining over the last 10, 15 years, unfortunately, pretty much everywhere. No? Measured PISA scores, you measure quality of university education, quality of education has been declining. And then people, currently, they have other options. They can do other things, no? And so they choose to do different things. Some go abroad and work abroad. Some do something domestically. But it's also the whole, the environment, what we call rewarding merit. That is not yet entrenched fully in most of the countries. How important it is to reward hard work and merit rather than say, well, everybody has a chance to go to university, everybody should graduate. That shouldn't be the case.
So what's one example of rewarding the merit?
You go to a university, everybody should be able to go to a university. You go to a university, at the end of the first year, for example, you take your exams or you take a test, whatever it is, and some of the students have put a lot of effort, they're doing well, they can continue. Some of the students who haven't done very well, they should not continue. In many universities in the region, no matter how you've done, they say, okay, well, let them continue. So in many universities in the region, there's the situation where de facto people are buying diplomas, either with their parents' money or with the government money, depending on what university they go to. So rewarding merit is give people a chance, but then rewards their hard work rather than reward mediocrity.
I want to focus now on the innovation, and you mentioned it as a very important step in the transition and infusion. What are some of the measures that the government of Kazakhstan may take to help to allow innovation to thrive? Or if we not focus on Kazakhstan, what are some of the measures that the government can take for innovation to prosper?
For many of the countries in Europe and Central Asia, the most important thing is to have a changed way of thinking about the private sector. And that is to allow the private sector, private enterprise, to thrive, to grow freely, right? In many countries, there are obstacles still, despite the transition and despite the many changes and progress, there's still obstacles to the private sector to thrive. No, there are regulatory obstacles, there are tax obstacles. You start making a bit more money, you hire a few more people, you have to pay different taxes, you have to register for different taxes, and it's not very easy, it's a bit more complicated. And so often feels an uncomfortable burden. Sometimes it could feel like a harassment. And so therefore, a lot of companies in Europe and Central Asia prefer to stay small. When you stay small, you don't have the resources to scale up, to grow. Indeed. You don't have the opportunity to bring more foreign knowledge. You don't have the opportunity or probably even the desire to be innovating. And so one important thing is try to reduce all the burden on companies to grow. Europe and Central Asia, we have such a huge amount of small companies, much more as a share of total number than in the advanced economies, in the developed countries. So that's one. The other thing is, you need a good level of competition domestically. You know?
Right.
So you need what we call a level playing field between large incumbents, meaning established companies, and young, small, dynamic, and new entrants, or state-owned versus private. And unless you have this competition, a good competition, and its enforcement by the competition agency or whatever national authorities may be in charge of it, if you don't have that, large companies may suppress small companies. No, they may be monopolizing the market or not allowing, in the case of energy companies, for example. Let's say you're a small hydro plant or you're a small solar plant. You're entering the market, large fossil fuel producers may decide they want to squeeze you out and not allow you by not allowing you to be connected to the grid, for example. So that, you know, reducing regulatory and tax and other obstacles to firm growth, creating the level of a good playing field through better competition, fixing the financial system. In many countries, small enterprises everywhere around the world have problem accessing financing.
Yes,
but
indeed.
in our region, it's even more problematic, no? And so if you don't fix the financial system, if you do not allow the financial system to intermediate resources, then these companies are going to be start of financing.
Yeah, and it's also about reducing the role of state, right, in the economy,
Absolutely.
and which is very
Absolutely.
huge here in Kazakhstan.
Absolutely, absolutely. Reducing the role of the state, reducing the role of the state-owned, and what we also call state-connected enterprises. Now, they may be private, but could be connected to the government because maybe they carry some important function, right, and receive a lot of financing.
So my next question is, we mentioned all the aspects, but what are some key aspects that drive productivity growth? Because you also mentioned in the presentation about the productivity growth, particularly who focus on economies like Kazakhstan.
So productivity is the efficiency with which you bring machinery and equipment, we call this usually physical capital, with human capital and energy. We bring these things together, and the efficiency with which you combine them to produce something, that's productivity. And so, you know, it's an interesting fact for Europe and Central Asia, and we can do this for any country, but for Europe and Central Asia, you take human capital, you take physical capital, add them up, and you say, that is what percent of the human and physical capital of, on average, per capita in the United States, and it comes to about 75%. I mean, then you say, well, interesting. The capital available to enterprises on average in Europe and Central Asia is 75% of the US level. But what is the output per person in Europe and Central Asia? Well, it's only 35%. Why is it that you have all this capital, but you produce only, 35%? So that's pretty much less than half of that. Yeah. And the reason is that productivity, the efficiency is not good, no? So there's a lot of inefficiencies using capital, using labor, using energy. So, for example, in Kazakhstan, per unit of output, enterprises use 4 times more energy than the countries of the European Union. For Europe and Central Asia, this is about 2.5, 3 times. I mean, imagine what a big difference this is, no? And so if you were able to reduce this even a little bit, can generate substantial savings for enterprises, for people, can scale up, bring more resources. I mean, similarly with human capital, a lot of inefficiencies, so a lot of waste, no? Many kids, half of the secondary school children in Europe and Central Asia go to vocational schools, no? The quality of education in vocational schools, that's measured by the PISA scores, is 40% lower than it is in general school. A massive, massive waste of human talent and experience. So there are a lot of wastes, similar on the physical capital. So these inefficiencies need to be plugged, and so that's why level of competition, hugely important, no? Reducing the state-owned enterprise, the share of state-owned enterprises in the economy, not reducing it on a whim, reducing it systematically in a way that makes sense, right? Not privatizing just to privatize, but privatizing only to create better efficiencies and use resources much more wisely.
Mm-hmm. And how does, for a country like Kazakhstan, being stuck in the middle income trap, we may say so, right? Being stuck in the middle income trap impacts average households, average citizens of the country?
Kazakhstan is moving towards high income. It was almost was a high income economy in 2014-15. Then productivity growth from very substantial growth before that actually turned into a contraction. So it's been contracting afterwards. So productivity, this efficiency we talked about, has not been improving. And so therefore the authorities, they're very mindful how this productivity has to be reversed, how the efficiency with which, resources are utilized has to be dramatically improved by focusing on freeing up the enterprise sector, allowing people to work hard, study hard, and get their efforts rewarded, and using energy much more efficiently. Clearly, if you are a higher income economy, your incomes are higher, no? The benefits from your labor are higher. Your perception of the progress the country is making is elevated. And so clearly affects everybody. And, when the economy is growing faster, when an economy is growing at 5%, it feels different than when an economy is growing at 2%, no?
Yeah.
So everybody is more optimistic. The big difference for the government is a big difference. They have more resources to spend on the public goods that are needed by everybody. People have an access to better paying jobs, more satisfying perhaps, with a higher component of innovation opportunity.
But sometimes it is the case that even though there is, the country reports an economic growth, how it is distributed among the regions is not that equal. Because if we speak about Kazakhstan, for example, we always see, yes, Astana, Almaty, very big city, economic growth. We can see how opportunities are present there. But if we turn just a little bit beyond those cities, we do not see the benefits that we just mentioned, right? And these regional disparities, they are quite evident.
Yeah.
So what about this regional disparities? How could we bridge the gap?
So one interesting observation about a large country by territory with these regional disparities is that the point is economic activity is everywhere in the world is very concentrated, right? And here too, it's substantially concentrated in Almaty, Astana, Shymkent, some of the other large cities. There's a lot more economic activity there than there is in some smaller areas or smaller villages, 100 kilometers outside Astana. And so that's okay in the sense that this is how it is around the world. Economic activity in the United States is very concentrated on the East Coast, the West Coast, a bit to the south. But people live in other areas too. And so it has to be that even though economic activity is very concentrated geographically, this agglomeration is actually a powerful force towards stronger growth. It has to be the job of the government to create broadly equal opportunities for people in terms of social services, education, health across the country, no? And so that's important. So even though, there are more factories, there are more opportunities for jobs in Almaty or Astana, the opportunities to go to school and the quality of the school and the quality of hospitals has to be broadly the same across the country. And then, there should be opportunities for people to move where the jobs are. So somebody wants to come to Almaty or Astana, how are they able to move? Is there something that prevents them? And in this country, some of the things that are obstacles are the fact that rental prices are high, or there are not too many places to rent. The housing market is very shallow, meaning there are not a lot of houses or apartments for sale. And so this clearly limits ability of people to move to where the jobs are.
And with inflation getting higher, it's been halved over the past year, but it's still around 8%, which is well above the country's targets. And the inflation is very much felt by citizens. And I think it just, hinders the opportunities, not only to move to big cities, but for people just to make their ends meet sometimes.
Well, it's true. Inflation obviously eats people's budgets, no?
Yeah.
It hinders opportunities, no doubt. If it's too high, it's something that has to be addressed.
And turning to my next question, I want to focus on the World Bank's latest economic projections. And if I quote, the recent report says that developing economies are projected to finish the first quarter of this century with the weakest long-term growth outlook since 2000s. What would be your projections for Kazakhstan?
So yes, we see this dramatic slowdown in productivity growth and output growth across the world. And it's not just the developing countries, also among the advanced economies, the developed economies, we see this growth slowdown from the first decade of this century to the most recent years and this decade that we're living now. For Kazakhstan, you mentioned last year was 4.7, 4.8%. For this year, we project a little bit higher growth because of the pickup in oil production. And then subsequently, we are thinking of growth coming down to about 3.5% or so in line with long-term potential. So peak this year because of oil production and then moderating output expansion to about 3.5% a year.
And what are the risks that's still present for the country's economy?
Well, an important risk is the fact that the economy is still fairly undiversified and very reliant on hydrocarbons, no? And so therefore it's a fairly narrow output structure, and that clearly impacts it through external shocks. If there's a slowdown in global demand or declining global prices or vice versa, the huge hit to prices, the economy is very vulnerable to that. Certainly, the world is in a bit of an interesting phase now. We don't know exactly the pace of innovation. There's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence. Is it going to affect growth potential substantially? Is it going to result in an increase in inequality across countries, within countries? I think this is important. Domestically, you mentioned inflation. That clearly is an issue. If that has to be brought down more substantially, so it doesn't affect households and their budgets. Fiscal policy clearly is something that needs to be watched. The government is talking about changing some of the tax rates, and so obviously that has to be implemented in a way to both reduce the impact of negative shocks on the population, but also ensure that macro stability, as has been the case over the last decades, continues to be sustained for the benefits of everybody.
Can I pick up on the point that you just mentioned about AI and its potential impact? What would be your thoughts on the potential impact of artificial intelligence? You mentioned that it's still unclear, but I just want to hear what you're thinking about that.
Well, certainly AI would have at least three impacts on jobs. It would replace some jobs, right? Basic coding, basic programming. So routine tasks that can be routine and simplified clearly would replace them. And so there are examples already that people with such occupations are no longer able to do that because they are replaced by AI. It would augment others, right? Add to their skills. I mean, there are a lot of examples that, for example, people working in call centers that have access to AI that can supplement the information base they have are much more efficient, right? Some 40%, according to some estimates, more efficient. Or people reading X-rays are much more efficient using AI. And then clearly it would create new jobs, probably more for designers, and it's obviously I don't know what, but so it has these three different impacts. Which one would dominate clearly depends on the strength of innovation. Clearly also would depend on how governments around the world react. Would they try to stop the AI's progress? Would they try to encourage it while regulating it where it threatens, let's say, security, whether it's personal security, government security, country security. So all of it depends. My sense is usually when we assess the impact of new technologies, we are super optimistic about the short term, a year or two from now, and not very mindful of the medium term. I think usually it turns out to be the other way around. Usually in the short term, the impacts are much more modest as people figure out what's going on. The impact over the long term certainly is going to be very profound. And so I think we look 10 years from now, probably we're going to have a much improved growth and much improved level of income. But it's again, not automatic. It depends on how governments react to this.
And if we speak about external shocks, we all know that the war in Ukraine, which is still ongoing, had a very serious impact on the economies in the region of Europe and Central Asia. But what was the particular impact on Kazakhstan's economy, and how do you think the government and the country is leveraging the crisis?
So, there was a massive shock from Russia's invasion of Ukraine on growth in the region. It was a massive shock to prices. So there was the cost of living crisis also resulted from that war, besides the COVID pandemic. And there was the disruption in various value chains in which countries participated, more for countries in Eastern Europe and Central Europe than for Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan and some countries in the Caucasus and Central Asia experienced an increase in imports from third countries and then re-export pretty much without much additional value added to Russia. So, we saw their exports and imports increase dramatically. This transshipment increased. For some countries, we saw the influx of people and capital from the Russian Federation. It doesn't seem to be such a dramatic case for Kazakhstan. And so for 22, 23, the first half of 24, as much as I can see the data, these renewed imports, so much larger imports and exports were to be noticed. I suspect these things would stabilize, are stabilizing now, but at least we had this hit, coming in, going out.
Yeah. Just to wrap up the conversation, one question that came into my mind when I see the reports, the economic reports, not just of the ones of the World Bank, we usually read about risks, projections, and projections are not very optimistic in most of the cases. Is it possible for economists to stay optimistic in the current period of time? What do you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Of course. Yeah. It's definitely possible, right? I mean, it's just that economists tend to look for risks and then to look for risks that are on the downside. They are a bit asymmetric. So, but yes, absolutely, it's possible to stay positive. I mean, if there are policies to improve the quality of education, the AI we talked earlier could have a positive impact on developments. It's absolutely possible to stay optimistic.
So are you optimistic
I'm
about
optimistic, yeah. I'm modestly optimistic. I mean, there are a lot of difficulties, but I'm modestly optimistic.
Great to hear that, because I'm an optimist too. So thank you very much, Ivailo, for this insightful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you to you. I appreciate it.